It's good morning for the first time to Yellow Shelf. Scott Leckie, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, Joe.
Oh, Scott, congratulations on your newest book. Well
Thank you very
done.
much.
The
Thank
Shrewd
you.
Little Sleuth. Tell us all about it.
Well, he was quite a shrewd little sleuth, my grandfather, who I never met. So I grew up, and it took a full 30 years before my father began speaking about his father. So that already, intrigued me. And then one day, I happened to take him out to lunch in a nice Italian restaurant in Southern California where I was visiting from Holland, where I was living at the time. And out of the blue, my dad just said, "Hey, Tiger." That's what he called me. Today's the 30th anniversary of my father's death. And I'm like, whoa, tell me more. Waiter, bring more wine, please. And so I started just pouring white wine for my dad, and he's drinking away. And then he went off on this unbelievable story tale and told me that his father worked for many years during the early years of the FBI, that he was extremely close to J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover, of course, was known as the state within the state in the United States. I mean, if you think things are bad in the United States now, it's not the first time. And J. Edgar Hoover, he spanned something like 14 different US presidents and kept secret files on hundreds and hundreds of Americans and so on and so forth. And then, I learned that my grandfather not only worked there, but he was in charge of security for the founding meeting of the United Nations. And the United Nations has been a full part of my life for my entire career.
Wow.
That he was in Pearl Harbor during World War II, that he became a private eye and was the only private eye ever to find Howard Hughes when he was in hiding, and it actually happened twice. You
Wow.
see that a little bit in that movie, The Aviator. Um, and then he was private eye for the stars, and then he was the chief investigator of the Hollywood purges of the McCarthy trials, one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history, led by the House on Un-American Activities, and he was actually the guy with a couple other guys in L.A., Hollywood, where I was born, um, investigating so-called communists and exposing them, to the world and to the United States Senate and everywhere else. And so he was working with Richard Nixon and creatures like that from that era. And then finally, he became, in the latter years of his life, he became private eye
Yeah.
for the stars, kind of hanging out in a bar called the Tail of the Cock, which might mean something, and maybe not, but maybe it does. And that's a big element of the book. Like, was he or wasn't he? Because
Yeah.
this was certainly a very not a publicly
Sure.
acceptable thing to be during that time. And of course, Hoover and all of his acolytes were now known to be very gay and very closeted and very publicly anti-gay and to the point of oppression. I mean, they were oppressing people for their sexual orientation.
Yeah.
And all of them were. And McCarthy was allegedly gay. Clyde Tolson, who was Hoover's deputy, was his boyfriend. Hoover himself and countless others in these high echelons of power in a government, in a system that was systematically oppressing gay people. And of course, very famously, Hoover had secret files on thousands and thousands of Americans that he would use as leverage whenever he wanted to get his way. And that's how he was able to stay in power for so long. At any rate, the story concludes with my grandfather being the private eye for Marilyn Monroe, none other than. And and then, a day before he died, he visited my parents and literally patted my mother on the stomach, on the belly. And that was the closest I physically ever came to my grandfather. And then the next day, literally out of the blue, totally suspiciously, he's dead in
Yeah.
his apartment, living with a man that nobody knew about called Carlos. Um, just dead on the floor. The front door is wide open.
Yeah.
He's working for Marilyn Monroe. He has Marilyn Monroe's, so according to family lore, has her private phone number in his back pocket
Yeah.
as he's found dead on the floor. And then 24 hours later, she's dead, 10 minutes drive away in another part of Los Angeles. So it's enough to make a pretty interesting story.
And it is. It's fascinating. I felt like I couldn't put it down. I felt like I wanted more. And what was that conversation like when you find out? about your grandfather, and then you write what, like, because you're a very successful human in this world. You've written fiction, nonfiction. I'm just wondering what that was all like for you.
Well, when you never met anybody, it's always interesting to investigate who they were, and particularly when my physical body is comprised of one quarter of him in terms of the
Yeah.
genes, and and although we have completely different worldviews, like as different as they could possibly be,
Yeah.
the simple fact of the matter is there are elements and traits that I've discovered about his personality and his way of living that are very similar to mine. Even though we see the world, I see the world totally as one consolidated entity and all humans as equals and the same. He would have put America on the pedestal, and I don't see the world like that. But there's many other characteristics too. But delving deeply into the life of your, paternal grandfather, I got to know him this way,
Yeah.
which is and I've honestly said to people, in actual fact, it sounds weird, but even though I was brought up by my parents until I was 17 and left home forever, I actually, in a certain way, know my grandfather better than I really knew and know my parents,
Yeah.
because I delved into the smallest intricate details. I mean, I did a Freedom of Information Act search way back in 2002. And so I've been planning to do this book for ages, but I just haven't gotten around to it because I have so many other things that I'm doing. And then delving into these pages, the FBI wrote back and said, we have 623 documents. And I'm like, whoa. And they said, but we're only giving you 533. And I
Wow.
was like, well, what's in the other 90?
I want the others. Yeah.
Yeah. And then even the ones I got, it was a huge package that
Yeah.
I got in my house in Switzerland where I was living at the time. And just going through that was like, like a treasure hunt. It was so fascinating. Every single word, had meaning to it. But tons of them were heavily redacted. I mean, some of the pages were almost entirely black with just like one word, my grandfather's name, and all the rest was black.
Yeah.
So there's clearly something more than even I got. And I really went to the greatest lengths I could to
Yeah.
get as much information as I could. I interviewed every living person that I know of
Yep.
that knew him personally. I mean, he would have been 120 by now or something. Yeah, I
Wow.
think he was born in 1905. So, there's not that many people left, but
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
interviewed the people, and even some that I interviewed have subsequently died. So they didn't get to see the publication of the book, unfortunately. But I delved as deeply as I could
Yeah.
into his life, and I really do know him now. And in fact, you won't believe this, but it's true. I have dreams with him in which I converse with him.
Wow.
Like when I on those, like I guess about once every month, I will have like a lucid dream,
Yes.
like where you can control the dimensions of it.
Yes.
And every so often, it's happened about 5 times now. I actually am in the dream, and then suddenly he appears, and then we start conversing, and I can hear his because he was born in Alabama, like really heavy duty South, and he has a soft Southern drawl, and he's talking to me back and forth, calls me Scotty, and that was his sister's name was named, I was named after his sister,
Yep.
who was named Mary Scott, which is not usual to have Scott as a woman's name, but anyway. Yeah, and so we're conversing, and then I finally kind of realize I'm conversing with my grandfather, who I never met, in the dream. And then I'm like, oh, I have to ask him the questions. I have to ask him. And every time I ask the question, like the big questions, were you murdered or did you just die?
Yeah.
Were you straight or were you gay? Did you love him? Did you not? And then he goes, well, and then I wake up. So I never get the answer from his mouth.
Ah,
It
look.
remains a mystery. All of it
Yeah.
remains a lot of mystery still, but I tried to unpack as much as I
Yeah.
possibly could with the information I had.
And what I loved about it, Scott, was that mystery, that idea that he had such an eventful and colorful life, but also
Mm.
family secrets. I think anyone can relate to that feeling of family secrets, things we don't know. And you've gone on this incredible journey to unpack your grandfather's life. I feel like there's a movie somewhere here, but no pressure.
Well, I'm already in discussions with certain
Oh,
people about
wow.
that. So,
Okay,
well,
watch this
not just
space.
that one, but I already am involved in certain movie making activities, mostly documentaries, but
Yes.
I'm an executive producer on a big documentary now.
Yeah.
and I'm talking to the director of that and some others that we'll see if it happens. But like
Yeah.
it's hard. I've spoken to directors in the past, and they say, yeah, it's totally worthy, in terms of a story, but
Yeah,
it's very hard to get like big
of
studio
course.
support for films based in the
Yes.
past more than 50, 60, 70 years
Yeah.
ago. Because you have to
And
recreate everything, and it's
yeah, of
hard. I can
course.
imagine from that
Yeah,
perspective.
yeah. No, that look, yeah, that makes sense. Scott, I visited your website, so I know how much work you do, not only as an author, you also have a career as a lawyer, an international lawyer, a humanitarian. Like, tell us about, and you mentioned your executive producer positions in films and documentaries. Tell us a bit about you, so we know who you are.
Well, I'm an international human rights lawyer, and I've been involved in the human rights scene since the 80s. I've worked in more than 80 countries on the ground. So,
Wow.
in war zones, disaster zones, lots and lots of slums,
Yes.
um, lots of times at the UN, writing lots of international laws and all that kind of thing. And have been, I dedicated my entire working life basically to trying in my own, minor way to make the world a better place, essentially. And I still do that every single day. I write books, I make movies,
Mm.
I create organizations, all that kind of stuff. I try to be the when I was just left home and I was like 18, I was traveling around Europe and I ended up in this house at a friend's, a very nice those Dutch houses with thatched roofs,
Oh
the
yeah.
thing you'd imagine in a fairy tale book, in a countryside setting. And it was really, for me, totally affluent situation, which I was not used to, being kind of a hippie traveler guy. And I sat down in their fancy living room and no one was around. And I looked on a table and I saw this book and it was called The War of the Flea. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And I picked it up and it was a book all about like guerrilla war, national liberation movements of the 50s and 60s, the anti-colonial movements of armed struggle all across the world. I'm like, what is this book doing in this fancy house? And I just started reading it and I couldn't put it down. And it really stuck in my head.
Yep.
And so I've tried to basically, in my own totally peaceful, legal, practical, political way, be the flea in the human rights world more
Yeah.
generally. So just, be bothersome to the powers that be to the extent that they change their ways so that, for instance, massive numbers of people don't get forcibly evicted from a slum, or that refugees get to reclaim their homes when they go back after having been ethnically cleansed,
Yeah.
and that disaster victims get the aid they need and stuff like that. So that's kind of what I do and what I continue to do now.
Yeah. Well, you yourself are a really interesting human. I would point anyone in the direction of your website to take a look at some of your work. We've only skimmed over it, Scott. But let's get back to the book. Congratulations. If we're watching anywhere around the world, we can get curious about this book. I know it's available globally, on lots of
There it
websites.
is.
Yeah. And do you want to just quickly mention the photo on the front?
Well, the photo on the front is my grandfather sitting there, who doesn't look that different than me, people say. But unlike him, I would never have a picture of J. Edgar Hoover in the background of my office. And there you can see it right
Yes.
there. There's a
Yeah.
little, like, so he has a portrait. I don't know who you are. You might be listening from Yemen, or you might be
Yeah.
listening from Chad, or you might be listening from Russia,
Yeah.
wherever. Do you have a picture of your boss in your office overlooking your every move? I don't think
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that was taken about 19, I'm guessing around 1935,
Wow.
in the very early years of what became the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI.
Yeah.
And there he is sitting there as a G man, as they were called, government man. It was a super high profile thing to be a G man,
Yeah.
fighting crime and helping the community. And in fact, they were doing that, but they were also doing a lot of, nefarious things as well. So I tried to capture the essence of him and that, and I have a whole bunch of other pictures in here too, which I've
Yes. Yeah.
collected. And one thing I neglected to mention, by the way, when my dad told me all of this at the beginning, my dad was this, my dad was that. I said, "Do you have any, like, because I was already writing books and stuff by
Yeah.
that time. Do you have Where are the files? Let me see like what his life was." He goes, "Well, I only have about," as he said, because he was American, 1 yard left." And I'm like, oh, you only have one yard, a meter's worth of
Yeah.
files. He goes, yeah, I destroyed all the other ones. And I'm like,
Oh,
oh no. So
yeah.
basically, he inherited around 300 immaculately kept files.
Wow.
He would have learned the trick of the
Yes.
trade from Hoover. So labeled, categorized, everything. He would have had a huge Marilyn Monroe file. He would have had a
Yeah.
huge, countless actors that he worked for. And my dad looked through them. My dad was a big time LA lawyer, and he
Yes.
looked through it from a legal eyes, like, oh no, this should be never be made public. So he destroyed
He
all of
just,
them
wow.
except for the 1 meter that he kept. So I
Yeah.
used that combined with the FOIA search interviews to come up with this book. But man, I wish I had those 300 files. Can you
Oh.
imagine? Can you imagine what
I
would have
wish
been
you
in
had them
there?
too. And I think
Yeah.
anyone watching this will think the same thing. It'll be like, oh my God, Scott, people must read this book. It is probably one of the most fascinating, and I come across lots of books, intriguing stories. Thank you for sharing the book with Yellow Shelf and the audience. Good luck. I know you're going to keep writing, and I would love to have you back in the future when more books come out.
I would love to. I've got a whole bunch of new books on the horizon. So yeah, happy to
Yeah.
do it anytime, very much.
Awesome. Well, people need to get connected to you in the book. So thank you, Scott. All the best.
Great. Thank you very much, Joe. See you next
Cheers.
time.